The ceasefire between the United States and Iran isn't what it seems. On April 8th, just hours before President Trump's 8 p.m. deadline, both nations agreed to a 2-week pause in hostilities. Markets celebrate it. Oil prices dropped from $117 to $107 per barrel. Headlines declared peace was possible. But if you look closer at what was actually agreed to, and more importantly, what wasn't agreed to, you'll see this ceasefire isn't about peace at all. It's about positioning for the next phase of this conflict. And the clock is already ticking. Let's break down what actually happened. Iran submitted a 10-point proposal to the United States through Pakistani mediation. Trump called it a workable basis for negotiation. The key demand from Washington was simple. Iran must completely reopen the Strait of Hormuz immediately and safely. In exchange, the U.S. would halt military strikes for 2 weeks while negotiations continue in Islamabad. Sounds straightforward, right? Here's the problem. Within 24 hours of this announcement, both sides were already accusing each other of violations. Iran's parliament speaker claimed 3 major breaches of the framework. First, Israel's continued bombardment of Lebanon, which killed dozens in coordinated strikes. Second, drone incursions into Iranian airspace. Third, Washington's refusal to recognize Iran's right to uranium enrichment. The U.S. response? Lebanon isn't part of the ceasefire. It's a separate skirmish. Those are Trump's exact words. A separate skirmish. Think about what that means. Israel launched 100 strikes across Lebanon in just 10 minutes on Wednesday. Rescue workers pulled charred bodies from vehicles in Beirut's busiest intersections. Apartment buildings collapsed. And according to the official U.S. position, none of this violates the ceasefire because Hezbollah isn't Iran. Except Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy force. Tehran funds them, arms them, and directs their strategy. You cannot separate the Lebanon conflict from the Iran conflict. But the ceasefire agreement apparently does exactly that. So why did Trump agree to this specific time frame? 2 weeks is simultaneously too short for meaningful diplomacy and too long for a simple tactical pause. If you wanted to de-escalate genuinely, you'd commit to 30 days, maybe 60, giving negotiators real time to work. If you just needed to reposition forces or rearm, 72 hours would suffice. 2 weeks suggests something else entirely. Let's consider what both sides gain from this window. For the United States and Israel, 2 weeks allows for critical operational adjustments. The Pentagon can rotate exhausted air crews who've been flying combat missions continuously since early March. Naval assets in the Persian Gulf can be resupplied. Intelligence can be processed and analyzed. Bomb damage assessments can be completed on the infrastructure strikes against Iranian petrochemical facilities and oil terminals. Most importantly, the U.S. can watch whether Iran actually reopens the Strait of Hormuz, or if they're stalling. Right now, over 400 tankers remain trapped in the Persian Gulf. That's 426 oil tankers, 34 LPG carriers, and 19 LNG ships sitting dead in the water. Each day they don't move costs the global economy billions. Shipping companies are terrified to send vessels back through the strait even during the ceasefire because they don't believe it will hold. Only 3 vessels crossed on Wednesday. 3. The entire global energy supply chain is watching to see if this corridor reopens, or if it remains a war zone. From Tehran's perspective, 2 weeks buys them something even more valuable. Time to assess how much damage they've actually taken. Iranian officials claimed their oil infrastructure at Karg Island, which handles 90% of their exports, remained mostly intact after U.S. bombing runs. Satellite data tells a different story. NASA's fire detection systems identified numerous hotspots along Karg's southern tip and western coast. Someone isn't telling the truth about the real damage. Iran also needs this pause to consolidate whatever international support they can muster. Pakistan positioned itself as mediator, which gives Tehran a diplomatic channel that doesn't require them to negotiate directly with Washington. That's crucial for domestic optics. The Iranian government cannot be seen capitulating to American demands after weeks of propaganda about resistance and victory. Vice President J.D. Vance will lead the U.S. negotiating team in Islamabad on Saturday. But here's the critical detail. Iran's hardliners have already begun framing any concession as a betrayal. The Iranian parliament speaker's immediate accusations of ceasefire violations weren't random. They were setting the narrative. If talks collapse, Tehran needs to blame Washington for acting in bad faith. If Iran refuses to fully reopen the Strait, they need justification. The violation accusations provide that cover. They're preparing their domestic audience for the possibility that this ceasefire was merely an interlude before the next round of strikes. But the real trap in this agreement is the Lebanon exclusion. By declaring Hezbollah operations a separate matter, the U.S. and Israel created a massive loophole that functionally allows the conflict to continue under the guise of ceasefire. Consider the strategic implications. Hezbollah has been firing rockets into northern Israel throughout this conflict. They've mobilized forces along the Lebanese border. They're an integral part of Iran's regional strategy, what Tehran calls its axis of resistance. When Israel bombs Hezbollah positions, weapons depots, and command centers in Lebanon, they're directly degrading Iran's military capabilities. These aren't separate conflicts. They're different fronts of the same war. Israel knows this, Iran knows this, and the ceasefire agreement deliberately ignores this reality. Why? Because it allows Israel to continue operations against Iranian proxies while technically maintaining the ceasefire with Iran itself. Netanyahu's government explicitly stated they support the U.S.-Iran ceasefire, but that it doesn't cover their fight with Hezbollah. That's not a bug in the agreement, it's a feature. Israel gets to keep hitting Iranian assets while the diplomatic clock runs on negotiations that were probably doomed from the start. Iran can either accept this arrangement and look weak, or they can retaliate and be blamed for breaking the ceasefire. Either way, they lose. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz remains the ultimate pressure point. This 21-mile-wide choke point handles roughly 21% of global petroleum trade. When Iran restricts access, energy markets panic. When they threaten to close it entirely, oil futures spike into triple digits. The ceasefire requires Iran to reopen it completely and immediately. But what does completely mean? What does immediately mean? These terms weren't precisely defined in the public framework. Iran could partially open the strait, allowing some traffic through while maintaining enough military presence to keep insurance rates prohibitively high. Shipping companies won't send tankers through a corridor where Iranian fast attack boats could strike at any moment. Even if Tehran technically complies by not blocking vessels, they can create conditions where commercial shipping remains too risky. That gives them leverage in negotiations while technically honoring the ceasefire terms. The United States has made clear that uranium enrichment in Iran must end. This is non-negotiable from Washington's perspective. But from Tehran's view, their nuclear program is a sovereign right and their only real deterrent against regime change. There's no realistic scenario where Iran completely dismantles enrichment capabilities in exchange for a temporary ceasefire, which means this fundamental disagreement remains unresolved, and both sides are simply buying time before the next confrontation. So what actually happens when these 2 weeks expire? 3 scenarios seem most likely. First, negotiations extend the ceasefire with minor adjustments. Iran partially reopens the strait. The U.S. scales back strike threats. Both sides claim victory while the underlying issues remain frozen. This kicks the crisis down the road but solves nothing. Shipping companies remain hesitant, markets stay volatile, and regional tensions continue simmering. Second scenario, talks collapse and strikes resume. If Iran doesn't sufficiently open the strait, or if the U.S. demands full nuclear disarmament, negotiations deadlock. Trump has already demonstrated willingness to strike Iranian infrastructure. His deadline threats weren't bluffs. The Pentagon has prepared target packages for bridges, power plants, and refineries. If diplomacy fails, Operation Epic Fury resumes, potentially with even greater intensity as both sides have had 2 weeks to prepare. Third scenario, and perhaps most dangerous. The ceasefire holds nominally while the conflict expands through proxies. Israel continues hammering Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq increase attacks on U.S. positions. Houthi forces in Yemen escalate Red Sea shipping disruptions. The war doesn't end, it just fragments into multiple theaters where the ceasefire technically doesn't apply. This is the trap scenario. Everyone claims to be honoring the agreement, while the violence simply relocates. The 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran isn't designed to end this conflict. It's designed to reset it. Both sides needed a pause to regroup, reassess, and reposition. The terms are deliberately vague enough that each party can interpret them favorably while accusing the other of violations. The Lebanon exclusion ensures fighting continues regardless of what happens in Islamabad. And the fundamental disagreements over nuclear enrichment, regional proxies, and Iranian influence remain completely unresolved. When these 2 weeks end, we'll likely be right back where we started. Except both militaries will be better prepared, both governments will have hardened their positions, and the diplomatic window will have closed even further. That's not peace. That's not even a real ceasefire. It's a trap. And the only question is, which side realizes it first?